You know, people often misunderstand what it truly means to be good. They think being good is synonymous with being nice, agreeable, compliant, endlessly forgiving, even when faced with malevolence. But that's not virtue. That's naivety. That's weakness masquerading as morality. Now, let's consider Christ. Not the passive, sanitized version we're often fed, but the real figure, the one who stood up to tyrants, who rebuked the Pharisees, who refused to cast pearls before swine when confronted with narcissists, those who were manipulative, deceitful, and self-aggrandizing. Jesus didn't appease them. He saw right through them, called them out, and walked away when necessary. That's not cruelty. That's discernment. That's strength under control. And so the question emerges, if the most compassionate, courageous man to ever walk the earth didn't tolerate narcissistic abuse, why should you? Jesus recognized narcissism instantly, not because he was suspicious or cynical, but because he understood human nature with perfect clarity. In his encounters with the Pharisees, scribes, and religious elites, he consistently demonstrated an unshakable awareness of the games people play to mask their insecurities and manipulate others for power, praise, and control. Narcissism at its core is a false self, built to secure admiration and dominance. It thrives on illusion, manipulation, and a refusal to accept responsibility. Jesus, in his divine wisdom and psychological acuity, pierced through that illusion effortlessly. The Pharisees were in many ways classic narcissists. They presented themselves as righteous, holy, and superior. Their outward behaviors were polished to impress the public. Long prayers in the synagogues, elaborate displays of religious observance, and an obsession with titles and status. But Jesus wasn't impressed by any of it. He didn't buy into their act. Instead, he called them what they truly were, whitewashed tombs. Beautiful on the outside, but dead inside. That language wasn't chosen lightly. It was deliberate and revealing. He wasn't afraid to expose the rot beneath the surface, even when doing so put him at odds with the most powerful people in society. This ability to name narcissism clearly is something most people struggle with. Many of us are trained to give others the benefit of the doubt, to assume good intentions, and to avoid labeling behavior that makes us uncomfortable. But Jesus was not hesitant when it came to identifying the destructive patterns in people's character. When he said, "You are of your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires," he wasn't being cruel. He was being accurate. He was acknowledging the reality of what he saw: manipulation, pride, deception, and the rejection of truth in favor of control. Narcissists often disguise themselves in virtue. They know how to play the role of the moral authority. The Pharisees used religion as a mask, but Jesus stripped that mask away with clarity and courage. He did not engage in endless debates with them to win them over. He did not flatter them. He did not pacify their egos. He exposed their hypocrisy directly. That act alone, naming narcissism, is powerful. It's the first and most essential step in disarming its influence. It takes moral clarity and emotional strength to look someone in the eye and see them for what they truly are when their entire identity is built on deception. Most people either fall for the charm or get caught in a web of second-guessing themselves. Jesus did neither. He didn't let their titles or reputations intimidate him. He didn't allow their social influence to blind him to their true nature. He was rooted in truth, and truth gave him the courage to confront what others feared to even acknowledge. There's a deep lesson here for anyone dealing with narcissists. We often feel guilty for naming what we see, for pointing out manipulation or arrogance. We're afraid of being called judgmental or worse, unloving. But Jesus shows us that clarity is not unloving. It's necessary. There's a difference between judging someone's soul and recognizing the fruits of their character. Jesus judged righteously, not to condemn people in their humanity, but to reveal the reality of their hearts. To recognize narcissism is not to hate, it is to see. And once you see clearly, you can no longer be deceived. Jesus didn't allow narcissists to twist the truth around him. He didn't allow them to hijack conversations or reframe the narrative to suit their fragile egos. He held fast to what was true, even when it provoked rage in those who preferred their illusion. Jesus never sought approval from the proud or manipulative because his identity wasn't rooted in external validation. He didn't need the applause of the crowd, the recognition of the religious elite, or the acceptance of those in power to know who he was. That level of internal stability made him immune to the traps narcissists set. Those subtle games where approval is dangled like a carrot to control others. Narcissists often rely on others' need to be liked, accepted, or praised. They weaponize approval, granting it when it suits their agenda and withdrawing it when they sense resistance. But Jesus was entirely detached from that system. He didn't operate on the currency of approval, and that made him impossible to manipulate. The crowd, particularly the Pharisees, could never get Jesus to dance to their tune. They expected him to play by their rules, acknowledge their authority, and seek their endorsement as a legitimate teacher or prophet. But Jesus did the exact opposite. He taught with authority, not as someone who needed permission, and this baffled and enraged them. They asked questions not to learn, but to trap him. They withheld validation, not because he lacked truth, but because he refused to conform to their expectations. Still, he never once tried to win them over. He never watered down his message to make them more comfortable. He never compromised truth to maintain peace or gain acceptance. That resistance to the need for approval is an act of strength that disarms the narcissist entirely. When people deal with narcissists, they often get stuck in the trap of trying to earn their respect or prove their worth. They work harder, explain themselves more, or even change their behavior in hopes of finally being seen and accepted. But Jesus didn't participate in that cycle. He didn't chase after those who rejected him. He didn't over-explain himself to the arrogant. He let their rejection stand because he knew it revealed more about their character than his. That kind of detachment is not indifference. It's wisdom. It's knowing that seeking validation from the wrong people corrupts your mission and compromises your identity. There's an instance where Jesus, after doing miraculous works, was met with skepticism from the religious leaders. Rather than being in awe, they demanded a sign, another miracle, another performance to satisfy their prideful skepticism. Jesus didn't comply. Instead, he said, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign." He saw through their demand. It wasn't born from faith or genuine curiosity, but from pride and manipulation. They didn't want to believe, they wanted control, and Jesus denied them the performance they craved. He understood that giving in to the proud only feeds their arrogance. He chose integrity over appeasement. This is a principle so many people miss. Not everyone deserves your explanation, your performance, or your effort to be understood. Narcissists will bait you with silence, criticism, or indifference just to get you to work harder for their approval. But Jesus never played that game. He didn't need their affirmation to know he was walking in truth. That's what made him so powerful and unshakable. Even when Jesus stood before Pilate and the crowds cried out for his crucifixion, he remained silent at times, not because he was weak, but because he knew their minds were made up. No argument would convince them, and no plea would change their hearts. He wasn't performing for their approval. He was walking out his purpose. That kind of focus is deadly to the narcissist's control. Narcissists thrive on the belief that your value is up for negotiation, that you need them to tell you who you are. But Jesus shows a different way. He teaches that when you know your worth, you don't need approval from those who withhold it as a weapon. You don't chase after acceptance from the proud. You walk in truth, whether they applaud or not. Jesus set boundaries without apology. And he did so with such clarity that it left little room for manipulation or confusion. He didn't explain or justify himself to those who tried to corner him. And he never allowed anyone to push him beyond the limits of his purpose. That kind of boundary setting wasn't rooted in coldness or indifference. It was rooted in a deep understanding of human nature, personal mission, and spiritual integrity. Narcissists rely on the absence of boundaries. They look for people who can be guilted, worn down, or confused into submission. But Jesus stood firm, knowing exactly where he began and where others ended. Throughout his ministry, Jesus constantly made deliberate decisions to withdraw, say no, or deny access to people who came with the wrong intentions. When large crowds gathered, excited by his miracles, he often left them to pray alone or told them not to speak of what they saw. He wasn't interested in feeding the ego-driven energy of the masses. He wasn't trying to build a following based on hype. Instead, he was intentional with his time, his energy, and his message. That's a boundary, and it's a radical one, especially in a world where people are constantly pressured to be available, to explain themselves, and to please others. One of the most striking examples of Jesus setting a boundary comes when Peter, one of his closest disciples, tries to intervene in his mission. When Jesus tells his followers that he will suffer and be killed, Peter pulls him aside and says, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." It's a moment of emotional manipulation disguised as concern. But Jesus doesn't coddle Peter or entertain the sentiment. Instead, he responds sharply, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." That response isn't cruel, it's clear. Jesus recognized that Peter, in that moment, was being used as a tool to tempt him away from his purpose. He didn't allow emotional closeness to cloud his judgment. That's what boundaries look like in action, refusing to let guilt or sentiment override truth. People who lack boundaries often find themselves drained and confused after encounters with narcissists. They say yes when they mean no, tolerate abuse out of fear of conflict, and feel responsible for other people's reactions. Jesus wasn't caught in that web. He never allowed other people's discomfort to dictate his decisions. He told the rich young ruler the truth, and when the man walked away sad, Jesus let him go. He didn't chase after him. He didn't lower the standard or soften the message just to keep someone happy. That kind of strength confuses and frustrates narcissists who expect others to bend, to accommodate, to fear rejection. Another example is when Jesus was in a house teaching and someone told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside wanting to speak to you." In that culture, family held immense authority, and the expectation would be to stop everything and go to them. But Jesus responded, "Who is my mother and who are my brothers?" Then, pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers." That wasn't a rejection of his family. It was a reordering of priorities based on spiritual truth. He set a boundary that defined who had access to him in that moment and why. It was a declaration that access is based on alignment, not entitlement. Narcissists hate boundaries because boundaries disrupt control. But Jesus was never controlled by guilt, pressure, or the fear of being misunderstood. He didn't owe everyone access to him just because they wanted it. He modeled what it means to be loving and firm, compassionate yet immovable. His boundaries were not walls of bitterness, but lines drawn in wisdom. They protected his mission, preserved his energy, and exposed the true intentions of those around him. Jesus walked away, even from those who refused to change, not out of resentment, but from clarity of purpose. He understood that transformation cannot be forced on the unwilling, and he did not waste time trying to convince people who were hardened in pride and resistance. His mission was not to chase, beg, or plead. It was to speak truth, offer grace, and let people choose. And when they chose rejection, denial, or manipulation, he simply moved on. That wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. It takes strength to know when to walk away, especially when you have the power to stay. One of the clearest examples of this was when Jesus instructed his disciples, "If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet." That's not just a practical instruction, it's a spiritual principle. It acknowledges that not everyone will receive truth. and it frees the messenger from the burden of convincing the unconvincible. Narcissists thrive on prolonged engagement. They want arguments, emotional investment, and ongoing attempts to win their approval. But Jesus showed that silence and distance can be more powerful than debate. Walking away sends a message that words alone cannot convey. In his own ministry, Jesus encountered people who were captivated by their pride and self-righteousness. When he stood before Herod, a ruler known for his vanity and manipulation, Herod was eager to see Jesus perform a miracle. He questioned him with mocking curiosity, hoping to be entertained. But Jesus did not answer him a single word. There is deep significance in that silence. Jesus, the Word made flesh, refused to speak to a man whose heart was closed and whose motives were impure. That moment reveals that sometimes the most powerful response to a narcissist is none at all. There were towns where Jesus performed miracles and preached truth. Yet the people remained unchanged. In those cases, he didn't linger. He didn't escalate his efforts. He acknowledged their refusal and moved forward. He even pronounced woes over cities like Chorazin and Bethsaida, not in bitterness, but in lament. He recognized the hardness of their hearts and the weight of their choice, but still he walked away. He did not demand repentance. He offered it. He didn't force transformation. He invited it. And when it was refused, he let the consequences follow. Many people stay in toxic dynamics far too long because they feel obligated to help, fix, or prove something to the unchanging person. They believe that persistence equals love, but Jesus models a higher form of love, one that honors free will, respects boundaries, and knows when to let go. Love does not mean enabling. Love does not mean self-sacrifice to the point of self-erasure. Jesus walked away not because he didn't care, but because he did, and because he refused to violate the integrity of truth by forcing it on someone who had already rejected it. This principle is especially powerful when dealing with narcissists who often bait you to stay through guilt, drama, or false hope. They may promise change, offer shallow apologies, or shift blame to keep you entangled. But Jesus was never entangled. He didn't confuse manipulation with repentance. He knew the difference between sorrow and transformation. And if transformation didn't occur, he didn't linger in denial. He moved on with purpose and peace. To walk away doesn't mean you're giving up on someone's potential. It means you're honoring their choices while protecting your own path. Jesus never chased those who chose darkness. He didn't stop loving them, but he let them go. He turned his face toward those who were ready, willing, and open, and he entrusted the rest to God. Jesus spoke truth boldly, even when it offended, because he understood that truth is not meant to pacify ego. It's meant to set people free. He didn't sugarcoat his message to win popularity, nor did he dilute hard truths to avoid conflict. He spoke with authority and clarity, knowing that those who truly desired transformation would embrace the discomfort that comes with truth. And just as clearly, he knew that those who clung to pride and power would resist, accuse, and reject him, not because he was wrong, but because he exposed what they wanted to keep hidden. Narcissists hate truth when it challenges their carefully crafted image. They thrive in environments where people walk on eggshells, where honesty is suppressed for the sake of harmony, and where no one dares to call out the elephant in the room. Jesus shattered that illusion. He confronted the Pharisees with words that pierced straight to the heart of their hypocrisy. He called them blind guides, whitewashed tombs, and children of hell. These weren't insults, they were diagnoses. They were statements of spiritual condition, intended not to humiliate, but to awaken. But narcissists don't want awakening. They want admiration. So instead of humbling themselves, the religious leaders plotted to kill the very one telling them the truth. Jesus didn't hold back, even when he knew his words would provoke rage. He spoke in the temple courts, in the synagogues, on the streets, anywhere people would listen. And he never adjusted his message to avoid offending the powerful. He rebuked religious elites in front of crowds. He corrected his own disciples when they misunderstood his mission. He even told a crowd of followers that unless they were willing to deny themselves and take up their cross, they couldn't truly follow him. Many turned away. But Jesus didn't chase after them or rephrase his teaching to make it more palatable. He let the truth do its work. This boldness wasn't reckless or harsh. It was love in its highest form, love that prioritizes liberation over comfort. Jesus knew that the truth often wounds before it heals, that it confronts before it transforms. He wasn't interested in maintaining shallow peace built on silence. He wanted people to face reality because only in truth can real healing and growth begin. And that meant risking offense, division, and rejection. He accepted those risks without hesitation. People dealing with narcissists often feel silenced. They're made to believe that speaking up is wrong, that confronting the truth will cause more harm than good. They're gaslit into thinking that naming the problem is the problem. But Jesus teaches otherwise. His life was a testimony to the fact that truth-telling is a moral imperative, even when it costs you relationships, reputation, or safety. The goal of truth is not to hurt, it's to reveal. And once something is revealed, it can no longer hold power in the dark. There's also a deep humility in Jesus' truth-telling. He never spoke from a place of superiority or ego. He wasn't trying to win arguments or prove he was right. He spoke because he loved. He spoke because he saw the destruction that pride and deception cause. And he refused to stand by in silence. He didn't speak to dominate. He spoke to deliver. And when people couldn't receive it, he didn't compromise. He remained rooted in the same truth, unmoved by their offense. Truth is the narcissist's greatest threat because it dismantles illusion. It brings accountability. It demands humility. And that's why Jesus faced so much opposition, because he refused to play by the rules of falsehood. He told people what they needed to hear, not what they wanted to hear. And in doing so, he showed us that true love is courageous. It doesn't hide from conflict. It steps into the tension and speaks what is necessary, even when it costs everything. Jesus modeled strength through silence and action, not people-pleasing, because he understood that true power doesn't need to be loud, flashy, or constantly validated by others. In a world where people often measure influence by attention and approval, Jesus demonstrated a deeper kind of strength, the kind that is rooted in purpose, restraint, and unshakable identity. He didn't seek to impress, persuade through flattery, or manipulate emotions to gain followers. His authority came from who he was, not from how others responded to him. This inner strength made him immovable in the face of pressure, mockery, and opposition. There were moments in his ministry where silence spoke louder than words. When he was brought before Pilate, unjustly accused and surrounded by chaos, he chose not to defend himself with lengthy arguments or desperate pleas. He stood in dignified silence, a silence that unnerved those who expected fear or compliance. Pilate was astonished, saying, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" Yet Jesus remained still. That silence wasn't weakness. It was a declaration. It was the strength of someone who knew that truth didn't need to be shouted to be real. It was the composure of someone who knew who he was, even if everyone around him missed it. Narcissists rely on reactive energy. They provoke, distort, and accuse in order to pull others into emotional chaos. They thrive when people feel the need to explain themselves, prove their worth, or beg for understanding. But Jesus never fell into that trap. He didn't chase approval, and he didn't defend himself against false narratives. He let his life, his actions, and his integrity speak for him. That kind of composure dismantles the narcissist's power because it refuses to play their game. It says, "I am not available for manipulation." Throughout his life, Jesus chose quiet obedience over public spectacle. He healed in private. He withdrew to pray when the crowds got too loud. He told those he healed not to tell anyone. Even after performing miracles, he didn't use those moments to inflate his image. He redirected glory to the Father and continued on his path without demanding recognition. This is strength, discipline, humility, and a focus on the mission rather than on applause. This quiet strength was especially evident in the way he endured suffering during his crucifixion. As he was mocked, beaten, and betrayed, he didn't retaliate or try to win the crowd back. He forgave. He entrusted himself to God. He endured the cross, not with dramatic vengeance, but with unwavering purpose. That's the kind of strength narcissists can't comprehend. Strength that doesn't need to dominate to win. It's not performative. It's not manipulative. It's rooted in something much deeper. The quiet confidence of someone who knows they are walking in truth. People-pleasing often comes from insecurity, a fear of being disliked, misunderstood, or rejected. But Jesus was completely secure in his identity. He knew some would walk away. He knew some would despise him, and he let them. He didn't try to soften the message to keep everyone comfortable. He didn't shape his words or actions to win favor. He chose to be true, even when that truth divided crowds and provoked anger. He lived with an audience of one, and that gave him the strength to endure every storm without compromise. In contrast, narcissists constantly seek admiration. They feed off of being liked, feared, or obeyed. But Jesus was never driven by ego. His strength came from surrender, not dominance, from truth, not control, from quiet endurance, not loud resistance. That's why his influence remains unmatched, not because he forced the world to listen, but because he walked in truth so powerfully that the world could not ignore him. And in his silence, in his refusal to please people at the cost of truth, Jesus left us a model. You do not have to explain yourself to be valid, nor do you need to please others to be powerful. Your strength is not in how much noise you make, but in how faithfully you walk in what's right.